Hey there, this is Bob Rapp, and I've been doing some work with some friends of mine at the AI Solution Group, and I wanted to share some of the things that I've been learning about prompting. I'm currently using Copilot 4.0. It's the paid version, it's my paid account, and I'm actually using something called Code Copilot. But it is just to be confusing. It's not actually the Code Copilot from Microsoft. It's the one that is in the OpenAI site. So a couple things that I'm going to do. First of all, I'm going to make it a lot easier to view my screen. So I'm going to zoom in and let's see here. Let's make it something like 150%. So I'm sharing this with the team just to give you a sense of how I'm doing prompting. And by the way, as I was out walking the dogs today, and out at Red's Fly Shop in the Yakima River Canyon. This is work that I was doing as I was walking along, talking to ChatGPT 4.0, and this is the Copilot. So I said, design an architecture for agents performing different tasks in three popular programming languages. So ensure that the overall architecture is flexible, modular, and scalable. And I said, and I had done some previous prompting to suggest that there might be an agent called a task manager, might be an agent interface, um, some task agents and execution. So I then talked through the task architecture, what each of those things would do, and the execution flow, and decided on using Python because I want Python typically for people that don't write software very well or aren't very experienced. Sorry, I don't mean to suggest they don't write it well. Maybe are beginners. It's a very easy thing to do to write Python code. It's also really easy to understand what's happening, right? So this gives me the code that I can copy. By the way, is it the best code I've ever seen? Well, no, but it is the best code I've ever written while walking the dogs around Central Washington. So, second is in JavaScript. JavaScript is very common in the enterprise. A little bit takes a little bit more skill typically to use. And then the next thing is uh, Java implementation. How would you actually do it? And then I ask it to summarize what it had done. So it'd give me Python, Node.js, and Java. And it says, do you want to add another agent to handle the different tasks and maybe do something via an API? I said, sure. So I'm going to choose Python. I'm going to optimize the code a little bit here. Now, by the way, it's garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't have a good idea, you actually don't know much about the subject matter, it probably won't end up in being very good code. I know a fair amount about architecture. Probably there are lots better developers than me in production, but I've been around software development for about 30 years. So then we build a logger agent, task manager, so it's the coordinating agents, then the main scripts, and the agent interface, the logger, and the task manager. Those are kind of beginning things now that folks could put together. Now, the interesting thing is, in general, it's hard for people who don't write software for a living or who don't do architecture for a living to see how would I do a new agent. So we said, show me a new agent. We're creating something called an email notifier. So it's actually showing us how we do that. It's going to send an email when we're tasked. Um, by the way, I'm not suggesting you go run this code in production. I'm suggesting that it's a good place to start your coding, and you can build complex architectures that you can test and improve. So I believe in study, perfect, automate. This is the first part of it. This is kind of just having a coding buddy here. So then how do I install and run the code on an Azure instance? You notice I have an Azure shirt on today. I use all of the clouds, but I particularly like some of the things I can do in Azure around serverless, which is the project I'm currently working on. So it tells me to go to the portal, create a virtual machine. It actually gives me a whole lot of interesting help to actually, here's the SSH line, where there's actually the SSH on Mac Linux or on Windows. I happen to use Mac, so that helps me And sudo gives me the upgrade, install Python, verify installation. Now, for those of you that know these things, you can just kind of run quickly through them. If you send email to me at bobrapp, B-O-B-R-A-P-P, 2Ps at gmail.com, I can also send you a copy of all of this stuff. So we've installed Python, the virtual machine, transfer the code. Now, I personally don't like virtual machines. I would personally say use a function here. And as you notice, as we go down here further, we're going to see some functions. So it says, how do we configure the environment to securely handle those credentials using Key Vault? And then it takes us through how we do all of the pieces for Key Vault. It's kind of cool. Key Vault, by the way, is where you would store your secrets. That's a good thing. You should never store credentials in the wild or in clear text. And then where do you put them in Key Vault? How do you grant access to the VM? Again, I'm not a huge fan of VMs. I personally prefer serverless, so we can just call a function and use a little memory and a little network. And then install the libraries, create the credentials in the Key Vault. That's pretty good. By the way, this is pretty good. This is about 30 minutes into the walk, then run the application. So set your environments, modify the app for your credentials, set up the Key Vault. What else do you need to do? Well, I said the agents need to interact with Azure Blob Storage as it's the place for our main index of HTML for serverless architecture. So we want to create an index.html as a static page, write it as welcome to the AI solution group, how can we help? And then have the agents look for any on change in a pickup directory for new user information. It'll be a file with a name, email, phone, country, write and process the code. Now, the reason I did that is I don't want to use some sort of cron or other scheduled command because I don't want to put any load on the system that isn't absolutely necessary. So we create the static HTML page, put it in blob storage. We do have a static file here. It's created, well done. We could put that in blob storage or do it via the CLI. The command line interface, by the way, is pretty easy to use because the CLI now has a bunch of AI prompts. So if you don't know what you can do in CLI, you can actually ask it and it will give you lots of examples. So here's some examples. Put it in a pickup directory. Now the pickup directory then will tell us that we need to do something with this code. We probably should check the pickup directory occasionally, right? Making sure that we're responding to our customers quickly. And you could set up a cron job or a function to monitor. And then I want it to be a change on the file system. So this would be using something called the Azure Blob Storage Event Grid. The event grid will trigger a function when something's added to the pickup directory. So we're not using cron anymore. And you see the code here. Now, by the way, all of these things could be done by different people who have different skills. But if you have kind of wide skills, but maybe not deep skills, it's kind of cool. So trigger, look in the pickup directory, see if there's something there. If there's something there, make sure that there is something that we should process and then go process it, right? We're going to test that function, then look at security and optimization. So secure the account, do some error handling, make sure we have some data persistence. So if we have a customer piece of information in here, we probably need to store it in a database. Let's use Azure Cosmos DB because it's probably cheaper than SQL Server. And probably we want to set up a production environment to connect the blob storage to Azure Cosmos DB. So we're going to set up the database, set up a container, install the database SDK. We may want to, by the way, call things via API. It's a pretty good idea. We probably don't want to do CLI if we don't need to. Later, we're going to do some other scripting, which would be kind of cool. So we're going to use this code to do some thingies, to quote my good friend Uli. And so again, it's basic database. And again, if you know a little bit about Cosmos DB or SQL, this would be easy. If you didn't, this gives you step-by-step instructions. Assume, by the way, this is a beta or an alpha. We're just writing some initial code, and then we're going to test it. So we created a trigger function. We have storage. We'll put it into production. Now we want to do some automated testing. It's always good to test your code and also run some unit test and some load testing. So we're going to set up unit test locally, create a file for the Azure function. Here's a unit test. This is just mocking up some of the data that might happen here. We're going to simulate the content, run the test locally, and then we're going to mock testing so Cosmos DB functions. Okay. Now, we're also going to do this as a part of an integrated function. So this is an Azure function test environment. We're going to use a CLI. Probably I would not use a CLI. I would probably automate this via the SDK. So an API call, method, property, action. Then configure alerts and monitoring to make sure this thing's all running, right? So we have the process to do that here. And then we're going to set up the CI/CD pipeline using GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions turns out to be a pretty cool thing to do. So it says when something happens, do something else. Actions and agents, by the way,